Daf Tezayin Amud Beis will begin Daf Tezayin Amud Aleph, the second line from the bottom. We learned previously that the Stam Tana of Stam Mishnah of Midos, the Tana is Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. We brought a raya to that because we learned that the eastern wall of the Har HaBayis was lower, so that the kind of side for the para that burned the para duma, when he did the hazos, he had to be able to look at the Pesach of the Heichal. So if he didn't able to see the Pesach of the Heichal, the wall would have to be lower so that he could look over the wall, over the eastern wall of the Har HaBayis, and be able to see the Pesach of the Heichal. Therefore, we brought a raya that therefore the Tana of the Stam Mishnah Midas must be Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, because otherwise, according to the Chachamim, it would not be necessary to lower the wall, because the entranceway of the Sha'arim, the Pesach of the Sha'arim, had a height of 20 amas. And that being the case, according to the Chachamim, the difference in elevation between the Har HaBayis and the floor of the entranceway to the Ulam was 19 and a half amas. The Har HaBayis, the elevation went up. So from Har HaBayis to the Ulam and the Heichal, it rose. And according to the Chachamim, the difference in height was 19 and a half amas. So therefore, according to the Chachamim, there would not be a necessity to lower the wall. If the Kohen looked through the top of the entranceway, the Pesach, which was 20 amas high, he'd be able to see the bottom half amma through the Pesach of the Ulam. And therefore, there would not be a necessity to lower the wall. But according to Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, the difference in elevation was 20 and a half amas, because he held that there was an extra amma that in the height over there where they put the platform for the Duchen, and therefore, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, you could not see through by looking through the Pesach of the Sha'arim. That's why the wall had to be lowered. So we brought a raya, therefore the Tana of Midas must be Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. But the Gemara now says, perhaps that's not so. Rav Ada bar Ava Omar, no. You can say the Stam Mishnah, the Tana is Hamani. You could say, who is the Tana? It is Rabbi Yehudi. Perhaps it's Rabbi Yehuda, not Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. The same we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Yehuda Imer, HaMizbeach Memutza V'Aimed B'Emsa Azor. The Mizbeach, Rabbi Yehuda held that the Mizbeach was positioned exactly in the middle of the Azara. So what were the dimensions? Ushtaim Amos Hayula. The Mizbeach was 32 by 32 amas. At least on the base of it, on the widest part of it, it was 32 by 32. Now, it did narrow. There had the foundation that had an amma around, and then it went up, and then there was a soivev that went around. It did narrow, but at the base, it was 32 by 32. Eser amas keneged pischa shel heichal. The middle 10 amas of the Mizbeach were opposite the entrance of the heichal. They were opposite the entrance of the heichal. Achadasrei amma l'tzafon, v'achadasrei amma l'dorim. So as was mentioned, the Mizbeach was exactly in the middle. The middle part of the Mizbeach was opposite the entranceway of the Heichal. 11 amas of it was to the north, 11 amas to the south. So 11 going from south to north, 11 amas. Then you have the middle 10 amas, so that's 21, plus the 11 amas that were to the north, and therefore that was 32. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, it comes out, so it comes out that the Mizbeach was positioned directly opposite the width of the Heichal and the walls and its walls. So therefore, the Mizbeach was blocking the entranceway of the opening of the Heichal. Now, the difference in elevation between the Har HaBayis and the floor of the Azora, not the entranceway of the Ulam or the Heichal, but the floor of the Azora, which is where the Mizbeach was positioned. The Mizbeach was positioned on the floor of the Azora, right? And then from the Mizbeach there were steps that led up to the Ulam. But the floor of the Azora was where the Mizbeach was positioned, was 13 and a half amas higher than the higher Abayis. So from the Har Abayis to the floor of the Azora, there's a difference in height of 13 and a half amas. That's where the Mizbeach was positioned. Now, the Mizbeach was positioned in front of the entranceway. The Mizbeach had a height the total height was 10 amas, but the 1 am of it was only on the kronis, on the corners. So to the top of the Mizbeach, excluding the corners, was 9. So that would mean that the Mizbeach was 22 and a half amas higher. At the top of the Mizbeach, excluding the kronos, was 22 and a half amas higher than the Har Abayis, and the elevation of the Har Abayis. So therefore, perhaps the Tana of Midas is Rabbi Yehuda, and the reason why the eastern wall, had to be lowered is because you couldn't see through the entranceway. The Pesach of the Sharm, as was mentioned, was only 20 amas high. Now, if the Mizbeach was in front of the entrance of the Heichal, the Mizbeach would be blocking the view, because the top of the Shorim was 20 amas. The Mizbeach extended up and to a height of 22 and a half amas higher than the ground level, on the ground level of the Har Abayis. So what's your right that it's Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov? Maybe the Tana of Midas is Rabbi Yehuda, that he held the Mizbeach was positioned in front of the entranceway of the Pesach of the Heichal, and it blocked it, because he held that the Mizbeach was mechuben keneged Heichal v'Kaislav. It was positioned in front of the width of the Heichal and the walls of the Heichal. The interior of the Heichal was 20 amas, and the interior was 20 amas, and the walls were 6 amas thick, the 6 amas wide. So you had 6 on each side, that's 12, and 20 amas of its width, that's 32. So the Mizbeach was positioned directly in front of that, and it blocked it. More says no. How can you say that the Tana of Midas is Rabbi Yehuda? Would you be able to find in Midas, the Tana of Midas, does he hold that the Mizbeach was in the middle of the Azara? You won't find that. Because Vatsanan, we learned in the Mishnah, and Midah is Kol Azara Haisa Oirech Meya Ushmaini V'Sheva. The length of the Azara was 187 amas long. Al Reichav Meya Shloshim V'Chomesh. The width was 135. So now the Mishnah details how it's made up. How is the length, and what makes up the length, and what makes up the width. Mina Mizrach Lamarav. So on the length from east to west, going from east to west, coming from the Har Abayis to the Kodesh Kadoshim, Mina Mizrach Lamarav Meya Ushmaini V'Sheva, as was mentioned, it's 187 amas long. So what is it made up of? Malkam Drisas Ragla Yisrael Chadas Riyam. The area which is the Malkam Drisas Yisrael, where the Yisraelim are allowed to go, that's 11 amas. Then moving further towards the west, the Malkam Drisas Ragli Kahanim Achadas Riyam, the Malkam of the Drisas Ragli Kahanim, where the Kahanim were, that was also 11 amas. So you have 22. Mizbeach Shloishim V'Shtayim. The Mizbeach, as was mentioned, was 32 by 32. So we had a total of 22. Now we have another 32, so that's 64. Bein Ulam Mizbeach Esr V'Shtayim. The area between the Ulam and the Mizbeach is 22. So now we have 66. The Heichal Mea Amma, the Heichal is 100, so 166. The Achadesrei Amma Achrei Beis HaKapayres, and 11 amas that is behind the Kodesh Kadoshim. So now you have your total, and the extra 11 is, you have the total of 100 and 187. So that's how we have the length of it. That what comprises the length of 187 in the length. Now, min hadorim litzof. So now accounting for the width, going from south to north. Min hadorim litzof and mea u'shleishim v'chomish is 135 amas. Now, as we'll see, there's the southern wall, and then there's a space between the southern wall and the beginning of the kevish, the ramp that goes up to the mizbeach. We're not accounting for that space yet. We'll account for that space shortly. But now the Gemara, the Mishnah rather, is starting from the kevish, from the ramp, which was in the south. So a kevish mizbeach shishim shtayim. The total of the two is 62. It's actually 64. The Mizbeach is 32, as we mentioned. It's 32 by 32. The Kevish is also 32, is 64, but the upper 2 amas of the Kevish overlaps the top of the Mizbeach. So that total is 62. Min Mizbeach l'tabah is 8 amas. Now going again from south to north, past the Mizbeach, you have the tabos. Those are the rings where the animal was set down on the floor, and the ring held it in place so they could shecht it, and without it thrashing and moving around out of place. So min mizbeach v'letabois, the space between the mizbeach and the beginning of the tabois are 8 amas. So we had a total of 62 plus 8, we're up to 70. Min mizbeach v'letabois 8 amas, and malkam tabois 10 v'arba. And the place of the rings themselves that occupy 24. So that is a total of 94 amas. Minatabos l'shulchanos arba. There's another 4 amas. That's 98 to the space between the bos and the shulchanos. They had the tables where they rinsed the avorim before they put it on the mizbeach. So they're up to 98 because that space occupied 4 amas. And min hashulchanos l'nanosim arba. So now we're up to 102. From the Shalom to the Nanosim, those are the pillars where they suspended the animals when they skinned them, when they flayed them. So that's was 4 amas, we're up to 102. Min Nanosim l'koisel azora, shmeina amas. From the Nanosim to the northern wall is shmeina amas, we're up to 110. So we have now a total of 135 minus 110, we have 25 amas to account for. V'hamaiser, and the remainder of the width was taken up between the area between the southern wall and the kevish, that space between the southern wall and the beginning of the kevish, and the malkum anosim, and the space occupied by the pillars. Now, what the Mishnah does not mention is also the malkum of the shulchanos, the place that the shulchanos, the space that the shulchanos, the tables themselves occupied. That's not mentioned, but as Rashi points out, it's before the pasuk in the Chesel, which was 4 amas. So therefore, this remainder, the space that's in the remainder, is now not 25 amas. We subtract the space of the tables, so the space occupied between the wall and the kevish and the malkum anosim was a total of 21 amas. Now, as Rashi mentioned, since it's not detailed which space occupied how much space, therefore it must be that they were equally divided between the two. Therefore, the area between the kevish and the wall was 10.5 amas. So if we take from the southern wall the space between that and the kevish, the total area of the kevish and the mizbeach, as we mentioned, was 62. Plus the 10.5 is 72.5 amas. Now the midpoint of the Azora, the midpoint, it's a total width of 135, so the midpoint is 67.5 amas, which means that the Mizbeach was not centered equidistant. It means that the Mizbeach, according to this Tana, that the Mizbeach ended at the area of 70, as we mentioned, at 72.5 amas. So, and therefore, it's extended past the midway part, 5 amas part the midway part. The midway is 67.5, and the end of the Mizbeach was at 5 amas past that, 72 and a half. So therefore, only 5 amas of the Mizbeach was in the northern section of the Azor. And all the rest of it was in the south, and it was not in the midpoint. So therefore, the Gemara says, how can you say that the Tana of Midas of Rabbi Yehuda, Mizbeach b'emsa Azora, mimishkachas lo? You don't find the Mizbeach in the middle of the Azor. Harub Mizbeach b'dorim koi. The majority of it was all in the south. There was only 5 amas that was in the north. So therefore, you see that the Tana of Midas is not Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore, Alalav Shmami no, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, he Shmami no. So you see that the Tana of Midas is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Rashi asks the following kasha: even though we've established that the Tana of Midas is not Rabbi Yehuda, but still, why do we have to say that the Tana is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov and said who holds that we had that extra height that brought up the height, the differential between the Harabayas and the entranceway of the Heichel, they brought it up to 20 and a half amas. Even if we don't know like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, even if the Mizbeach only 5 amas was in the northern half of the Azorim, but we know that the entrance of the Heichel was centered in the middle of the Azorim. So even if only 5 amas of the Mizbeach was in the northern half, it still would have obstructed the entranceway, and therefore you still would have to lower the eastern wall of the Harabayas to lower it to see above it, because you wouldn't be able to see through it because the Mizbeach still would be obstructing it. Rashi answers that the Mizbeach narrowed. It was 32 by 32 at the base, but that you had the Yesod, so it came in, it had the wide part of the base, but then it rose and it came in. And then you had the Soivev, it came in again. So therefore, at the top of the Mizbeach, it was only 28 by 28. And therefore, you would have the entire 5 amas of the northern part would not have been obstructed, because the Mizbeach at that section was narrowed to 28. You would have the 5 amas to the north would be clear and not obstructed. Therefore, according to the Chachamim, you would be able to look over the wall and see through. That's why the Tana of Midas must be Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, who held that there was an extra amma, so that was 20 and a half amas differential in height between the ground level of the Harabayas and between the bottom of the entranceway of the Heichal. So therefore, even if you looked at the top part of the entranceway, which is 20, it still would not be able to see the entranceway, which was 20 and a half amas higher.